Hello, Heath Jones here from Northwood Christian Church, and today's gospel reading is found in the 13th chapter of the Gospel of Luke, and we'll be reading verses 31 through 35, and it goes. At that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to him, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." He said to them, "Go and tell that fox for me, listen. I am casting out demons and performing cures today and tomorrow, and on the third day I finish my work. Yet today, tomorrow, and the next day I must be on my way, because it is impossible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you. And I tell you, you will not see me until the time comes when you say, 'Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord.'" I've noticed something while reading stories to my kids. I've noticed that many of them have as a common theme this basic idea, that there is a main character that is faced with some seemingly impossible task. And the character is relatable usually because they're not presumptuous, they're not especially qualified, or even extraordinary in any of the ways that you might expect the hero to be. But when faced with the impossible task, they rise to the occasion. And of course they rise to the occasion, but in the better stories, we cannot see from the onset how they are going to do this. Let me cite you a few examples. For example, in the book A Wrinkle in Time, written by Madeleine L'Engle, Meg, the protagonist, discovers that she and she alone must go back to the planet Camazotz to rescue her brother Charles Wallace. Camazotz is a wholly evil planet, wholly captive by an evil force, and this force has possessed her little brother Charles Wallace. And she cannot see how she will accomplish her task that she feels is bearing down upon her, for she is as vulnerable to the evil as anyone else. Yet she knows that she must go into the jaws of certain defeat, but still she must go. Or a more lighter-hearted story that follows a similar theme, if you have the eyes to see it, is Big Friendly Giant by Roald Dahl. We're reading this right now with my kids. And there's this young girl named Sophie who has to go to the Queen's palace to tell her that there are giants in the land and that something must be done about it. And she is scared to do so because she feels something like Moses, I suppose, bringing the unwanted and difficult message to the sovereign. And her friend, the Big Friendly Giant, is quick to point out that her mission is impossible, that nobody will possibly believe her, much less the Queen. But they both know that it is the right thing to try. In fact, they feel as though they absolutely must, no matter the cost. And so they go. Then, of course, there's Frodo from that book, Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, or those series of books. And if you've read them, you'll know that Frodo doesn't even fully grasp the gravity of the situation. And by the time he comes to terms with it, he comes to the conclusion that he is going to his certain death. To travel with that ring that he must destroy to Mount Doom where it must be destroyed is not only to travel into the jaws of certain defeat, it's a death sentence. But still he goes, and his friend Samwise goes with him. And my kids have grown so used to these stories that they aren't nearly as anxious as they used to be when we read them together, because they've heard enough of these stories by now to know that the heroes will win out. And they don't know how, and they may not see the way forward, but by now they've discovered that that's most of the fun. Discovering what miracle or turn of luck, or should I say turn of fate, will bring the story to a satisfactory end, one in which justice is satisfied, love wins the day, bravery is rewarded, the tired find rest, and when the people can live happily ever after. A good story ends with something like that vision from the book of Revelation chapter 21, where the seer sees a new heaven and a new earth, where every tear is dried and all is life, light, and love. But to get there, we all know that the way is hard. Meg into Camazotz, Sophie into the Queen's Palace, Frodo to the brink of Mount Doom. Perilous journeys. But I want you to notice that these stories follow a logic that is voiced again and again in the Gospels and lived out by Jesus himself. Jesus faces impossible situations, yet somehow life and love prevail. Jesus is saved while saving those around him. Of course, Jesus' story does have a fair amount of foreshadowing along the way. Many stories do. You can tell that things are going to get bleak before they get better. Jesus as much as says this. In Luke chapter 9, verse 22, he said, "The Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised." True, on the third day raised, but first, killed. Jesus was committed to giving his life's energies to what mattered to him. We believe that what mattered to him is what matters to God. And so we, along with Jesus, give our life's energies to what matters, and some give everything for what matters. Today's text is meant to inspire us by the depth of Jesus' commitment to his work. Notice what's going on here. The passage opens, and we find Jesus doing what Jesus does. He is ministering to the people as we've seen him do up to this point. He is actively healing and restoring the people by the power of God. But then some of the Pharisees come to Jesus with a warning. Herod Antipas, the regional ruler, is out to get him. In fact, it would appear that there's been a hit put on Jesus. And the record shows that Herod Antipas was likely good for his word. He has already, up to this point, beheaded Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist. So this is a legit threat, and we observe what Jesus does. And what does he do? Does he pack up and move on? Not at all. Instead, he responds, "Go and tell that fox for me, listen, I am casting out demons and performing cures today and tomorrow, and on the third day I finish my work." In other words, Jesus is telling the despot, I'm going to keep doing what I came here to do. In fact, for the next 3 days, you'll know where to find me. And in this moment, Jesus stands in solidarity with anyone who has lived a life in which they were threatened whilst doing the Lord's work. Those who have received death threats for doing what is right. Priests killed in South America. Dissidents jailed or killed for standing up during Nazi Germany. Martin Luther King Jr. threatened and then shot in Memphis. Jesus does not cave to the threat. He does not cave to the fear. He takes it in stride. Does the threat have teeth? Well, in time we'll come to discover that, in fact, it does. Seems as though Jesus already knows this. And his next words, all of this being taken in, his next words are telling. He goes on to describe Jerusalem, the holy city, as something like a prophet trap. Jesus was a Jew, and he knew his history well, and he knew that many times the people had been visited by a prophet, and that the prophetic voice had not been well received. And then Jesus speaks hyperbolically, saying that it's basically impossible for prophets to be killed any place else. And I emphasize that he was speaking hyperbolically, for we know that prophets can be silenced and are silenced wherever there are people. But he singles out Jerusalem. After responding to the threat of Herod, he singles out the holy city as sort of a threat to him as a prophet. And as a Jewish man himself, he has every right to sort of have this in-house conversation. He says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it." And one may expect that these feelings would lead Jesus to travel out and away from that place, never coming to return, at least not until things settle down. But he only brought it up, it would seem, to allude to his intentions to return, in spite of and in the face of the danger. He said, "And I tell you, you will not see me until the time comes when you say, 'Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord.'" And if that last line sounds familiar, it should. He's alluding to a story you probably know well. That story of his triumphal entry when they're waving palm branches and saying, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And that's the day we celebrate on Palm Sunday. It's the day where he was received with shouts of adulation. So Jesus is saying, the next time I come back will be basically a week before my death. Here, Jesus is signaling to those around him his intention to return to the city, the very city inhabited by a governor who wants him dead, the very city that has silenced prophetic voices in the past. In short, Jesus is committed to returning into the jaws of certain defeat, certain death in his case. And why? Does he have a death wish? The answer to that question, why does he return, is simple. In the name of love and in the name of what is right. He will return in spite of all else because he has a deep and abiding love for the people. And his love for the people is encapsulated in these words, quoting from verse 34, "How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." Before I move on, I should note what has often been noticed. Here is one of the examples where God's love is expressed in maternal and feminine terms. Jesus, the embodiment of God's love, expresses his love in these maternal and feminine terms. The embodiment of God's love loves the people like a mother hen who gathers her chicks under her wing to harbor them, to protect them from danger. It's as if Jesus is saying, Herod wants me dead. Many others do as well. But what I have always wanted to do was to hold them close and to shelter them from the trauma, from the danger, from the brokenness of the world. And because my love for you is so, I will be back. I may be returning to my death, but I will be back. And that is what he did. I'd like to take a moment to pause and reflect on two kinds of courage. One kind is reactionary, and this is the kind of courage that we discover in ourselves when we are faced with an immediate need to respond bravely to something that happens that we could not have seen coming. Perhaps someone falls into the ice, and you are then compelled to intervene with very little to no forethought. But then there's the second kind of courage, and that's preemptive courage. This is the kind of courage you discover in yourself as you prepare yourself to face an adverse situation well before it has occurred. Perhaps you're readying yourself for a medical procedure that's weeks away and you're nervous, and so you're trying to shore yourself up for this. Or perhaps you're getting ready for a tough conversation that you don't want to have. Personally, I've tried to imagine what it would feel like to prepare myself for some great battle. A real military conflict where the odds are grim. And I simply don't know how I'd respond, and the prospect of having to even prepare for that preemptively terrifies me. But again, I emphasize we're speaking of preemptive courage here. Courage up front to go into the danger before you've gone. And this is the kind of courage that Jesus reflects in this passage. He knows that he is going to face real danger, yet he isn't about to pause his healing ministry until the work is done. He calls Herod's bluff, but even if Herod weren't bluffing, he would have continued to heal in spite of the danger. He will leave the city, but expects to return to the holy city in spite of the danger. And in Luke's gospel, it will become clear to the reader that Jesus expects to die when he does return. But still he goes because his love for the people is as a mother's love for her children. This is resolve. This is courage. The reason the best stories, even children's stories, reflect these themes is because The most important decisions in life must be met with this kind of courage and resolve. Love of God and love of God's children compels us, calls us to this sort of preemptive courage. In the book A Wrinkle in Time, Meg goes back to the dark planet to save her brother, and she has no guarantee of success, that she will indeed leave the jaws of defeat, the jaws of death. In fact, she is convinced that she will fail, but she makes up her mind and goes. In the book The Big Friendly Giant, Sophie decides up front that whatever the result, she must appeal to the queen, telling her of the giants and of the need to intervene. And in The Lord of the Rings, Frodo sojourns on with the ring, believing he is headed straight toward death. Each step is an exercise in preemptive courage. So many stories teaching us the gospel in so many ways, that the Christ-like are willing to carry their cross even if that brings confrontations with ridicule, hardships, or worse in the future. Faith in Jesus requires what the 20th century Protestant pastor and theologian Reinhold Niebuhr described as sublime madness. A sublime madness. He wrote that those who oppose justice and oppression must be possessed by this sublime madness. He noted that, and I'm quoting him here, "Nothing but madness will do battle with malignant power and spiritual wickedness in high places." In other words, you got to be crazy to do it. Journalist Chris Hedges writes of this sublime madness, quote, "Sublime madness demands self-sacrifice and entails the very real possibility of death. Not that the rebel possessed of sublime madness wants to die, for the fight against radical evil is the ultimate affirmation of life. The rebel understands the terrible power of the forces arrayed against all rebels, and how far these forces, once threatened, will go to silence rebels, and yet is so possessed that he or she is unable to conform." And you could replace that word rebel in this context with prophet. A prophet who will go to whatever end, inspired by this divine madness that Jesus possessed. And Jesus told his disciples that they need to carry their crosses. Jesus carried his cross quite literally, and he died. But then he was found to be alive. They could kill his body, but his body was restored. They could silence him for a time, but his disciples soon discovered that they were the body of Christ, the body of the one they followed, and were empowered to live into the vision Jesus cast for the human race. Jesus was possessed by this divine madness and an intense, devoted love, a love for Jerusalem, a love for his friends, for the human race. He even loved that old fox, Herod, his enemy. This love is transforming the world, will remake the world. It may call us into great danger, but it calls us also to life. The stories I read my children often end with the light breaking in at the final moment. Salvation comes in the morning. Bravery and sacrifice leads to life and freedom that no one expected to find, but they went anyway. But there it is, life and freedom. Against all odds, Meg rescues her brother. Sophie ends the terror wrought by the giants, and Frodo destroys the ring, and the whole earth is saved. Jesus breaks the powers of empire and of death, and we are presented with new and astonishing possibilities for life. And we as Christians are invited into this story. Ours is the next chapter that will tell of our trials, our bravery, and of our salvation, as we ourselves skirt the valley of death's shadow in order to save lives and discover that along the way is our salvation as well. Or as the hymn reminds us, Jesus calls us o'er the tumult. Or, as Jesus once said to his disciples, and I'll conclude with these words, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will save it.